Charlie Watts was never the loudest member of the Rolling Stones. He didn't strut across the stage like Mick Jagger or hurl guitars like Keith Richards. He wasn't flamboyant, he wasn't wild, and yet he was the one who kept the world's greatest rock and roll band alive. For nearly 60 years, Watts sat behind the kit with a quiet grace, his rhythms so steady they became the heartbeat of rock itself. To generations of fans, Charlie was more than a drummer. He was a legend. His style was unique, understated, precise, and unshakably cool. While other drummers chased attention with thunderous solos, Watts stayed in the pocket, letting the music breathe. He made it look effortless. But here's the twist. Behind all the acclaim, all the decades of success, Charlie Watts himself admitted that there was one drummer he could never match. It wasn't Ringo Starr, nor was it John Bonham or Keith Moon. This wasn't about rivalry. It was about admiration. Charlie once revealed the name of the man he considered untouchable, the one drummer whose skill, intensity, and artistry left even him in awe. And when fans heard his confession, they were stunned. This is the story of Charlie Watts, and the drummer he believed he could never equal. When people think of the Rolling Stones, the first images that come to mind are Mick Jagger's wild strut or Keith Richards' cigarette-dangling riffs. But ask any serious musician what truly kept the Stones alive for decades, and the answer is simple: Charlie Watts. Born in 1941 in London, Charlie never fit the mold of a rock star. He wasn't flashy, he didn't crave the spotlight, and he certainly didn't buy into the chaos that surrounded his bandmates. While Jagger and Richards fed the tabloids with their wild nights and endless controversies, Watts quietly returned to his hotel room with a sketch pad, preferring to draw rather than party. He was, in every sense, the calm at the center of the storm. Yet behind that calm exterior was one of the most respected drummers in music history. Unlike many rock drummers who pounded their kits with brute force, Charlie approached the drums with subtlety and restraint. His background was in jazz. Artists like Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, and Charlie Parker shaped his musical ear. This gave him a unique style, laid back, swinging, and always in service of the song rather than his own ego. Keith Richards once said, "Charlie Watts is the engine. We don't go anywhere without Charlie." And he was right. Watts wasn't about showmanship. He was about groove. He made the impossible look simple, holding together classics like Paint It Black, Jumpin' Jack Flash, and Start Me Up with a steady pulse that never wavered. His drumming was invisible in the best way, so perfectly placed that you almost didn't notice it, yet without it, the entire song would collapse. Off stage, Charlie lived with the same quiet elegance. He stayed married to his wife Shirley for more than 50 years, a rare feat in the rock world. He collected suits, horses, and antique drums. To his bandmates, he was not just the backbone musically, but personally, the one man who never lost his grounding in reality. But beneath his gentlemanly demeanor was a deep humility. For all his success, Charlie never thought of himself as the greatest drummer in the world. In fact, he was his own harshest critic. He knew his strengths: groove, subtlety, restraint. But he also knew there were drummers who possessed a level of power and artistry he could never hope to match. And when asked about the drummers he admired most, Charlie did not hesitate. He pointed to jazz giants, men who redefined rhythm itself, who played with such intensity and creativity that even the Rolling Stones' heartbeat felt small by comparison. Among them, one name stood out. The drummer, Charlie Watts, said he could never equal the one who towered above them all. Long before he ever stepped onto a stage with the Rolling Stones, Charlie Watts was a student, not of rock, but of jazz. Growing up in post-war London, he spent hours listening to records of Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, and Duke Ellington. But what captivated him most were the drummers. The men behind the kit weren't just keeping time, they were shaping the music, pushing it forward, giving it texture and fire. Charlie would later admit that he never set out to be a rock drummer at all. "I wanted to be a jazz drummer," he once said, "and somehow I ended up in a rock and roll band." That jazz foundation shaped everything about his style. Where most rock drummers attacked the beat head-on, Watts danced around it, giving the Stones their unmistakable swing. His earliest heroes included Max Roach, a drummer whose precision and melodic sense turned the drum kit into an instrument as expressive as any horn. Roach wasn't about brute force. He was about conversation, making the drums speak. Watts admired that restraint, that sense of elegance, and tried to bring it into his own playing. Then there was Buddy Rich, the technical powerhouse whose speed and control were legendary. Watts often shook his head at Rich's superhuman ability, admitting that no matter how much he practiced, he could never come close. Buddy was in another universe, he once confessed. While Watts thrived on groove, Rich thrived on dazzling. The audience, and of course there was Art Blakey, whose thunderous, soulful playing drove the jazz messengers. Blakey combined raw energy with deep feeling, something Watts respected enormously. But among all of these influences, one name stood above the rest: Elvin Jones, the powerhouse drummer of John Coltrane's legendary quartet. Jones didn't just play rhythm. He unleashed storms behind the kit, creating rolling polyrhythmic waves that transformed jazz forever. Listening to Jones, Watts felt both awe and defeat. He later admitted that no matter how hard he tried, he could never summon the same intensity, the same spiritual depth. Watts once described Elvin's drumming as a thing of beauty, like watching the ocean move. But it was also intimidating. While Charlie had built his career on steadiness and subtlety, Elvin Jones seemed to command forces of nature. His playing wasn't about control. It was about surrender, letting the music take over. This was the standard Charlie measured himself against, and it humbled him. Even as he toured the world with the Rolling Stones, selling out stadiums and playing to millions, part of him still felt like the boy in London, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a jazz record spinning, wondering how Elvin Jones could make the drums sound like that. Charlie Watts was a legend, yes, but in his own mind, there was always a gap between what he did and what his heroes achieved. And eventually, when asked to name the one drummer he could never match, Charlie didn't hesitate. The confession was simple, honest, and deeply human. For most of his life, Charlie Watts avoided the spotlight. He rarely gave long interviews, and when he did, his words were measured, thoughtful, and often understated. He didn't need to brag. He didn't even like talking about himself. But on the rare occasions when he spoke about other drummers, his humility came through in striking ways. One such moment came during a conversation about his jazz influences. A journalist asked Charlie if there was any drummer he felt he could never reach, someone who stood on a level all their own. Without missing a beat, Charlie replied, "Elvin Jones." The answer didn't surprise jazz aficionados, but to casual fans it was a revelation. Why would the drummer of the greatest rock band in history, arguably one of the most successful musicians of all time, confess that he couldn't match someone else? Yet for Charlie, it was simple. "Elvin was the best," he said. "I could never play like that." Elvin Jones, who powered John Coltrane's quartet through the 1960s, was not just a drummer, he was a force of nature. His polyrhythmic style created layers of sound that seemed to swirl endlessly, pushing Coltrane into spiritual heights. To Watts, Jones represented everything drumming could be: technical brilliance, raw power, and an almost mystical connection to music. Charlie described listening to Jones as overwhelming. "It's like waves crashing over you," he once remarked. "You don't just hear Elvin, you feel him." For Watts, who valued subtlety and restraint, Jones's style was something entirely different, almost unattainable. He admired it deeply, but he knew it wasn't who he was. What made the confession so moving was Charlie's honesty. He didn't try to place himself on the same pedestal as his heroes. Unlike many rock stars, he had no need to project superiority. Instead, he elevated others, openly admitting his limits. In a world filled with ego and competition, that humility made him stand out even more. For fans, the revelation that Watts revered Elvin Jones above all others also explained his own style. You could hear the jazz influence in the way Charlie left space in the music, the way he never overplayed, the way he let the groove breathe. He wasn't trying to imitate Elvin, he knew he couldn't, but he allowed Jones's spirit to guide his sense of rhythm. Even Keith Richards acknowledged it. Charlie loved those jazz guys. Elvin Jones, Art Blakey, that's who he measured himself against, Richards said. But he never gave himself enough credit. Nobody could do what Charlie did for us. In the end, Charlie's confession wasn't about inadequacy, it was about perspective. He recognized greatness in others while still holding true to his own path. By admitting he could never match Elvin Jones, Charlie showed that even legends bow to their heroes. And yet, for millions of Rolling Stones fans, it was Charlie Watts, not Elvin Jones, who embodied perfection. Because while Jones may have shaken the heavens, Charlie kept the world's greatest rock band grounded night after night for nearly 6 decades. Charlie Watts' confession about Elvin Jones wasn't a dismissal of his own career. It was a reflection of his humility. In an industry built on ego, Charlie was refreshingly different. He didn't need to remind anyone of his talent. He didn't need the thunderous solos or the spotlight. His greatness spoke quietly, through restraint, through consistency, through the fact that he made one of the wildest bands in rock history sound grounded. Fans and fellow musicians often marveled at how Charlie never seemed to get caught up in the myth of the Rolling Stones. While Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were hailed as gods of rock, Charlie carried himself like an ordinary man with an extraordinary job. He wore tailored suits instead of leather jackets, preferred sketching in his notebook to partying, and lived a quiet life with his wife of over 50 years. His drumming reflected that same sensibility, steady, refined, reliable, and yet that honesty about his limitations, the admission that he could never match Elvin Jones, was exactly what made him so admired. Charlie didn't pretend to be everything. He understood what he was, and just as importantly, what he wasn't. He wasn't the powerhouse like John Bonham, he wasn't the showman like Keith Moon, and he certainly wasn't the hurricane of rhythm that was Elvin Jones. But he was Charlie Watts, the heartbeat of the Rolling Stones, and nobody else in the world could have done that job the way he did. Musicians across genres paid tribute to this humility. Jazz drummers respected him for acknowledging his influences, while rock drummers idolized him for creating one of the tightest grooves in music history. His confession about Elvin Jones wasn't a sign of weakness, it was proof of wisdom. Charlie knew that music wasn't about proving you're the best, it was about serving the song. Keith Richards once joked that the Stones could have survived losing Mick or even himself, but not Charlie. Without him, the entire foundation of the band would crumble. That wasn't hyperbole. Charlie's drumming may have been understated, but it was irreplaceable. He gave the band its backbone, a subtle swing that made their music roll instead of crash. When Charlie passed away in 2021, tributes poured in from across the world. Musicians remembered not only his legendary drumming, but also his quiet dignity. He was a man who could stand on stage in front of hundreds of thousands, playing with the most iconic band in history, and still feel like a student in awe of Elvin Jones. That humility was his superpower. It kept him grounded, it kept him human, and it reminded the world that even legends have heroes. In the end, Charlie Watts didn't need to match Elvin Jones. He didn't need to outplay him, outshine him, or prove himself in comparison. What made Charlie great was that he stayed true to himself. He wasn't Elvin, he wasn't Buddy Rich, he wasn't John Bonham. He was Charlie Watts, and that was more than enough. And so, his legacy lives on. The gentleman of rock, the quiet storm, The drummer who kept the stones rolling, not by being the loudest, but by being the truest. And the man who taught us all that greatness isn't about being better than others. It's about being the best version of yourself.